Okay, welcome everyone. As you start to join, if anybody's got their microphones on, can you mute them, please? And can you also leave your cameras off? I mean, I'd love to see lots of faces, but for now, if you can switch your camera on, actually. Why not? Just have a sudden flash of everyone's faces. But if we can keep mute so that we don't get massive interference with audio problems. Thank you, Josh. Hello. Welcome to this evening. Sorry about the slight delay in our start. We had a few technical hitches at our end, just making sure that everyone was connected up. Welcome to University of Westminster in Zoomland. My name's Nick Beach. I'm Senior Lecturer in the History and Theory of Architecture here at the School of Architecture and Cities. A few housekeeping notes. I've just said, if you could keep your microphone switched off. When Barnabas starts speaking to us, our speaker this evening, if you could switch your cameras off just so that everyone can focus on his screen to prevent interference, feedback and distraction. After our speaker has finished, we'll hear from some respondents, including me and others, and we'll also be collecting questions. We can do that through the chat. So if you just want to leave Barnabas a message in the chat, I can then read that out to him. Or you can raise your hands with the sort of, the yellow hand that goes up, and then I can turn to you, ask you to switch your camera and microphone on, and you can ask Barnabas a question direct. We're recording the session this evening, and we'll make that available on a University of Westminster site for students and staff. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Barnabas Calder, a historian of architecture at the University of Liverpool, who joins us to discuss his book, Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Crisis, published in 2021, so last year, by Pelican Books. As Barnabas knows, I devoured that book on my family holiday in Tenby in Pembrokeshire last summer, recreating in sand some of the buildings he explores, as I devoured his previous book, Raw Concrete, The Beauty of Brutalism, in 2016, a work which first displayed for a broad reading public Barnabas's passion for both the architectural history of modernism in Britain and the value of materiality for appreciating and understanding those buildings. As some of you here will well know, I've already introduced architecture from prehistory to climate crisis to our first year undergraduate syllabus, and it's generated a really healthy debate about how we should think about the architecture of the past and present in terms of energy use, production and consumption, how we should interpret the architecture of the past in light of the climate emergency, and how we make value judgments, aesthetic and discursive, about architecture and cities. I can't wait to hear direct from Barnabas this evening, his own summary and particular interest in the book. So without further ado, I will hand over to him. You'll have to unmute though, Barnabas.
A simpler technical problem than some of the previous ones. Apologies for the late start, everybody. That's in large part because I didn't get there in time for the technical rehearsal because I was getting supper for my children. So thank you all so much for your patience, and thank you ever so much to Nick and the University of Westminster and Paolo for your invitation to speak. Form follows fuel. Energy, our food and our fuel, energy has always been the single biggest factor in shaping all human affairs. Energy has shaped the built environment more than anything else, with architecture's exorbitant energy demands for deploying and obtaining materials and for keeping people warm in cold places. Today's dominant energy source, the burning of fossil fuels, has already pushed large areas of the world towards ecological collapse. And things are likely to get much worse if we don't achieve an energy revolution fast. There can therefore be no higher priority in all human affairs than radically reducing our emissions. Yet at the moment, greenwashing and self-deception, backed by feeble or dishonest environmental assessment systems, fuzzy thinking and misunderstanding, allow developers, construction companies, and almost all of the built environment sector to continue with profitable but ecologically devastating business as usual. Despite decades of talk about sustainability and much excellent research, the construction and operation of buildings is still responsible for 39% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Much the largest source of climate change emissions, around 60%, is the burning of fossil fuels as an energy source. And we require a massive energy transition urgently if we're to minimize climate catastrophe. And energy needs to be the central concern of architecture now. So what I offer those of you pursuing practice or research or education in architecture is a simple question that I believe can enrich almost everyone's thinking and help tie it in, help tie everything you do in to the great concern of our age. And you can ask it of almost anything. My question is, how does this relate to energy systems? It's a superficially modest question, but when applied constantly to past, present, and future, it opens up a new understanding of the world. Nor is this an anachronistic projection of a contemporary concern back into earlier periods. Energy has always, I propose, been the single biggest influence on architecture throughout its entire history. Earlier societies didn't tend to theorize all energy's different forms as a single phenomenon, as we do. But equally, they didn't theorize gravity in the way we do. Their architecture was nevertheless as totally shaped by energy as it was by gravity, however they understood those universals. It was early in the 20th century that energy, defined in utilitarian fashion by scientists and engineers as the capacity for doing work, energy came to be understood by the sciences as the great common factor that unified all the sciences. My contention is that in our century, the arts and humanities should also embrace the explanatory power of energy to reinterpret our fields. My book's the first attempt to answer this key question: how does this relate to energy systems, across a range of architectural case studies around the globe over the past 14,000 years. It's a big sweep of history to try and encompass in one book, but we can only understand the all-encompassing global challenge of today's climate emergency by investigating the physics and economics of how we got here. You see the great changes in energy systems not in the tight frame of one city or one nation during 1 or 2 decades, but in the long sweep of history. It's when you compare today's energy systems to ancient ones that you recognize most clearly the spectacularly anomalous nature of almost all architecture today, shaped as it is still overwhelmingly by modernist practices and theories. Accordingly, my book is organized around these 3 main categories into which energy historians divide human energy systems: hunter-gatherer, agrarian, and fossil fuel. Hunter-gatherer energy systems, past and present, are enormously diverse, characterized typically by groups optimizing their environment to streamline their harvest of naturally occurring energy, food, and fire fuel. Hunter-gatherer groups' architecture is generally, like everything else in their lives, closely related to their energy systems. Groups who move around a lot in pursuit of seasonal foods build quickly and simply, if at all. Hunter-gatherers who tackle the coldest environments, like the mammoth hunters who braved the Ice Age landscape of Ukraine 14,000 years ago and built this, have to invest more time and more calories in building weatherproof, robust homes. This is perhaps the earliest known building, drawn by Gingerhead Design for my book, and it makes the link between energy systems and architecture incredibly strikingly clear. It is actually built of food energy waste, mammoth bones and reindeer hides. Form follows fuel. It was even heated by burning mammoth bones as fuel. It must have really stunk, but if it's a choice between poor air quality and unendurable cold, humans have always chosen the poor air quality. Hunter-gatherers' architecture is rarely profligate, its designers and builders understanding the energy cost far more intuitively than we do, because they procured the materials by the work of their own muscles, work that could otherwise be invested in food production or replaced with pleasanter activities. The enormously diverse energy systems that we lump together as hunter-gatherers supported hominins from several million years ago through the evolution of anatomically modern humans around 200,000 years ago and on to the present, despite increasingly ubiquitous aggressive marginalization and oppression by agrarian and fossil fuel states over the past 6 millennia. But most of what gets discussed in architectural history is crushed into these few millennia since the advent of the first agrarian states, which arose around 6,000 years ago, exploiting a niche created by a series of domestications of cereal crops and animals. Where hunter-gatherer energy systems typically aim to optimize energy harvest per person, rapacious expansionistic agrarian states instead sought to maximize energy produced per unit of land, downgrading most people and domesticated animals into tools to shape increasing proportions of the Earth's landmass to privilege the staple grasses like rice, maize, barley, and millet, and trees for firewood. Much denser populations could be supported by the new system, several hundred times more people per hectare than in typical hunter-gatherer contexts, and the storable, easy-to-tax crops that farmers could produce on fertile land supported a small, very steep hierarchy of rulers and religious leaders, and populations of city dwellers who could specialize in things other than energy production. Form follows fuel, and a new energy system brings new architecture, in this case, the monumental mega projects of the agrarian elite. 80 to 95% of the population of most agrarian states worked unpleasantly hard in the fields, living in poverty with a narrow, unhealthy diet to support the non-farming minority whose artifacts and buildings make up so much of the historical record. Most of the first half of my book looks at the architectural outputs of these sorts of societies and how differences in the details of their energy systems produce differences in cultural and architectural outputs. I trace the outburst of creativity and efficient systematization that arose from the enormous urban boom of Song Dynasty China following a change in rice variety that almost doubled the rice harvest year to year. This is the Iron Pagoda in Kaifeng, shown to the same scale as the Mammoth Bone House to give a sense of the sheer size of agrarian monuments. Again, to the same scale, here's the Pantheon in Rome, showing similar construction industry responses to the urban boom of Imperial Rome during its climate optimum and the peak of its grain importation from Egypt. I investigate the immense scale of the pyramids of Giza, Khufu's pyramid, again here shown to the same scale. At least since Herodotus, the pyramids have been presented as the products of destructive megalomania. Yet my question, how does this relate to energy systems, suggests a different reading. Construction on this scale probably had a functional dimension in disposing of enormous seasonal surpluses of human muscle power, which, left to its own devices, could have become a threat to the regime. People working hard on a highly organized project are kept busy, fit, and subordinated. Agrarian architecture beyond the humble homes of the farming majority was shaped by twin realities. Labor was, for the powerful who controlled the food surplus, consistently very cheap indeed. From 1800 BCE to 1300 CE, across a wide range of agrarian societies, Walter Scheidel has shown that the overwhelming majority saw rates of pay for unskilled laborers hovering around a subsistence level, where a worker's daily pay could feed the worker, but to support a partner and children, other family members would often have to supplement the food income. At these prices, Song, Roman, or Egyptian rulers, or French cathedral chapters could afford a very great deal of labor, and their buildings show it. Form follows fuel. But all this labor is of limited value in some respects. Human muscles are pathetically weak. It took in the region of 78 million days of labor to build the Pyramid of Khufu. But if you take that and equate it in modern energy terms, any 7 average Americans today will in their lifetime use more energy between them than it took to build the Pyramid of Khufu. In other words, any extended contemporary family in North America, Europe, or Australasia controls energy resources equivalent to the handful of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. What was not cheap, even for the very powerful in history's farming economies, was heat. Industry, cooking, and heating all needed to be served by slow-growing firewood, supplemented in poorer domestic contexts by burning slighter plant matter and animal dung. Cooking was non-negotiable even for the poor. Humans can't survive long-term on raw food. The firewood that was grown to meet these needs typically took up lands that could otherwise be used for food, and the result was that firewood was almost always scarce and expensive. As far north as London, for instance, a medieval city of 10,000 people required 10,000 hectares of firewood coppicing to meet its heat demands. With poor roads, worse in winter, transporting enough wood placed an effective limit on the size of medieval cities in colder climes. Energy historians describe this and other agrarian economic limitations as the photosynthetic constraint. This concept describes an upper limit on the energy available to agrarian societies, set by the amount of energy their crops and trees could harness from the sun annually. This had immense implications for their economies and their architecture. If you think about an industry like glass making or iron making, we are familiar with the modern pattern that the more of it you do, the cheaper it gets. Within the photosynthetic constraint, the growth of the industry put pressure on firewood supplies and drove up prices until the product itself became even more expensive. Such restraints limited growth across the economy. The architectural implication can be seen, someone or other has scribbled a little red line across in protest or accident. The architectural implication can be seen here. Even in one of the richest families in the Liverpool area in the 16th century, deliberately showing off their wealth through abundant windows, they couldn't get glass better than this rubbish when wood had to be burnt to make it. This is terrible glass. And when you look at glass in the context of the photosynthetic constraint, examples like the medieval mosque lamps of Cairo or the Ile-de-France's ecclesiastical windows are even more impressive than art historians conventionally acknowledge. The mystery factor that's driven the extraordinary economic growth of recent centuries has been this freedom from the photosynthetic constraint provided by fossil fuels, where the more you extract, the more you can invest in extracting more, and all the industries dependent on them can profit from ever-dropping costs and ever more powerful energy services. The implications of fossil fuels for architecture are immense. We routinely use levels of energy for building materials that the world could not possibly have afforded in an agrarian system. To sustainably furnish the world's current energy consumption for cement production alone, using the dominant agrarian source of intense heat, charcoal, would require the entire output of an area of coppiced woodland larger than Australia, just for cement. Express that energy as human labor and it gets even more absurd. To furnish the same amount of useful energy annually as we use for cement would require an enormous group of healthy adults working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, every week of the year. A group, in fact, 4.7 times larger than today's entire human population. That's just for the energy we put into cement production. Steel would add more than the same again. And once you add aluminium, glass, plastics, the figures just become utterly ludicrous. In these circumstances, whilst the social injustice of the agrarian world is repulsive, its self-restraint on heat inputs in architecture is hugely cheering as we seek to escape our dependency on fossil fuel heat. The enormous baths of Caracalla, shown here keeping scale with the pyramid, they still tower over a large area of central Rome despite almost 2 millennia of spoliation. This astounding solidity was achieved using very modest heat inputs and materials sourced impressively locally. 76% of the volume of materials for this building was extracted within 20 kilometers of the site, and under 6% of the volume was made up of the two materials that required heat to make, brick and lime. The statistics are from Janet Delane's extraordinary study of the building, a sort of reverse quantity surveying job. Today's buildings, by contrast, are almost entirely composed of materials requiring huge heat inputs and transported around the planet using inescapably cheap diesel. Form follows fuel. So it will come as no surprise that fossil fuels changed everything. And half of my book is devoted to the few centuries in which they have come to transform the world. Adrian Forty's feedback was that it should have been more than half. Even though it's such a short piece of human history, so much has changed during it because of the intensity of heat energy in fossil fuels. Our long dependency on them makes us blind to their ubiquity in our built environment. Britain has been dependent on fossil energy since the 17th century, when coal produced the Georgian house, coal-fired brick walls, coal-made glass for the lovely big windows, and coal-forged iron building tools, nails, hinges, and so on. These were genuine improvements, big enough to make it worth coping with the growing pollution of coal smoke that Elizabeth McKellar describes so fascinatingly in her work on Georgian London. With fossil fuels, heat became vastly cheaper. And with the steam engine, that cheap heat could be used to replace muscle power for an increasing range of tasks in transport, manufacturing, and even from the 1850s, some aspects of construction labor, as labor costs rose with material living standards. The long-standing agrarian pattern that labor was cheap, heat expensive, was dramatically reversed by coal, radically changing the materials, construction practices, and operation of buildings. The total amount of energy available was vastly greater thanks to fossil fuels. A pre-modern farming family could typically harvest in the region of 1.2 times what they consumed themselves. Victorian coal miners could extract 500 times more energy than they consumed in food. Abundant coal energy magnified everything, good and bad. Scientific understanding and technological development, growing diffusion of political power in industrializing countries, but also an expanded scale and ambition in imperialism and colonial exploitation, a grotesque magnification in trade in enslaved people, bigger wars, pollution, and vile industrial slums. Coal energy built British Victorian cities like Liverpool, where I'm speaking from. Coal-fired bricks transported by coal-powered trains joined together with coal-fired mortar lit by coal glass windows by day and coal gas lighting at night. The division British architectural historians are prone to make between Victorian and modernist architecture is in energy terms largely false. Victorian and Edwardian buildings explored all the energy-hungry materials and services that were to characterize modernism. Metal used for whole buildings, here St George's Everton, 1814, testing out a prefab iron frame intended for export to the British colonies. Reinforced concrete frame construction, here the Liver building, 1908 to 11, advertising Enbeek's concrete system to American businessmen passing through the port to and from Europe. Air conditioning and central heating systems, here at St George's Hall, opened in 1854, with steam engine pumped purified air, powerful artificial lighting, someone or other's not muted, and factory mass production of building components. In a complex interaction with colonialism and the trade in enslaved people, coal promoted Liverpool's fast sprawling urban development. I've plotted Liverpool's growth against the energy consumption of England and Wales, using beautiful maps drawn for the book by Chris Dove. 440 years after its foundation in this image, Liverpool remained negligible. The country's energy consumption, visualized in the red bar on the left, was modest and still largely based on new-grown food and firewood, not yet coal. 75 years later, there isn't that much change in either the energy levels or the city size, despite the gathering pace of British colonialism. After another 60 years, both national energy consumption and city have roughly doubled, and more than doubled again after another half century. The first ever intercity railway, seen here 6 years after its opening, combined with an immense rise in static steam engine power for manufacturing, saw energy consumption and the city explode together in tandem, more than quadrupling the city and the energy levels in the 60 years to 1896. And both then continued to rise through the first half of the 20th century. The aesthetics of modernism arose from the thrillingly overheated reaction of some gifted youngsters in Italy, the USSR, France, and elsewhere to their own country's faster-moving second-generation fossil fuel revolutions. Beautiful modernist villas of the 1920s and 30s were problematically greenhouse-like in hot weather, and in winter they were essentially a continuous cold bridge, maximizing heat loss through balconies, exposed soffits, and roof gardens, with single glazed metal framed windows an integral part of their aesthetic. This is often passed off as an unfortunate side effect of experimental new technologies, but my question, how does this relate to energy systems, again offers a different interpretation. One of the joyous freedoms that the early modernists were gleefully exploring was the freedom to heat large uninsulated spaces using powerful fossil fuel boilers. Open-plan cubist villas were an elated escape from the age-old Northern European tradition of houses that huddled their rooms together round the chimney stack to profit from every joule of warmth they could conserve, dividing rooms into sealed units small enough to heat with an open fire or stove. Form follows fuel. The freedom conveyed by fossil fuels hit its most extreme expression in the 1960s, which was also when European energy levels peaked, when Cedric Price's high-tech vision, still seen as an inspiring model of flexibility to many, proposed to replace constricting conventional enclosures with canvas warmed by powerful hot air blowers, all intended to be swept away within 10 years at most. It's terrifyingly profligate by now that we understand the sources of anthropogenic climate change. Planning too changed radically with cars and newly affordable construction materials. Le Corbusier and others looked at giant reinforced concrete and glass factories, like the Fiat Lingotto car plant with its racetrack on the roof, and asked why cities should accept the notion of ground level at all. With new energy-hungry materials, concrete, steel and glass, why couldn't roads, pedestrian routes, and buildings weave themselves around each other with complete design freedom? At the Barbican, 60 years later, they did it. For the first time in human history, it became common to design interiors where, without a constant supply of electricity to pump fresh air in and keep the lights shining, audiences of hundreds in these lower spaces in the arts centre would, over the following hours of complete darkness, die of gradual asphyxia. And it's so normal, people don't think of that when they go down there unless they have phobias that make them aware of it. The ravenous energy consumption of architecture since the 20th century is not superficial and incidental, but fundamental. Asking how does this relate to energy systems shows up modernism as being first and foremost a joyous celebration of fossil fuels. Via modernism, energy profligacy is built deep into the DNA of today's architectural theories and practices. Indeed, modernity itself could arguably be seen as the spread of fossil fuel economics and culture around the world, taking with it all sorts of other cultural things in its trappings in this very problematic and complex and interesting way. At present, almost all practitioners and educators in architecture and the construction industry globally remain trapped squarely within the path dependencies of fossil fuels. Concrete and steel remain ubiquitous default materials, despite their catastrophic carbon footprints. Energy-hungry services continue to whir in most new buildings, and architectural form making continues to prioritize too many other things over operational and embodied carbon. And I don't say this in a spirit of blame. All of humanity is currently snarled up in a fossil fuel world culture, which has brought real benefits as well as real problems. But if we want to reach zero carbon, we must first help our sector face the truth of its current situation. In my opinion, we will only achieve the level of change required via very well-crafted and honest regulation, free of the damaging effects of lobbying. Here again, history can be encouraging. After a millennium and a half of London being built like this street in York, of flammable wood, straw, and animal dung, the 1666 Great Fire, which destroyed around 2/3 of the city, was followed by clear, well-enforced regulations on fireproofing, and the rebuilt city was constructed with excellent fire protection between buildings. It was to be the 21st century before we deregulated enough to cause mass casualty fires again on a comparable scale. For students and practitioners, if zero carbon threatens our current models and habits, there's something exciting about that too. The great revolutions in form and materials that have developed alongside past energy changes have spawned thrilling opportunities for technical and stylistic innovation. For gifted, sincere architects, there's an opportunity to help establish the richest architectural variety and quality ever seen. Each region responding to its climate and its locally available low-carbon materials, as was the case before the adoption of fossil fuels, but this time helped by the extraordinary technical mastery available through contemporary environmental and materials science. I'd like to end with 5 suggestions for architectural students, practitioners, academics, and researchers in the face of climate emergency. Firstly, I'd suggest that people consider my question of today. How does this relate to energy systems? Take it with you everywhere. Ask it of everything. It opens up, I think, a new understanding of the world that is revelatory and urgent. Secondly, we should be courageous and ambitious in quantifying aspects of architectural history and practice. Climate change is a quantitative challenge, and to understand it, we need to come to terms with kilowatt hours and with tons of carbon dioxide. I haven't found this easy myself. I'm a classic humanities graduate, but I have found it worthwhile. Energy historians and engineers have done a lot of the hard work, furnishing us with an enormous body of historic data and understanding, and it shines into the architectural past and the architectural present like a searchlight, illuminating and clarifying. Thirdly, and partly related to the previous point, we need to collaborate beyond our narrow disciplines with engineers, materials scientists, restoration architects, and all sorts of others. Fourthly, we should work to build diverse collaborations internationally around the theme of energy and architecture. Only by bringing together the voices of scholars from a diversity of cultures, backgrounds, genders, and ethnicities can we establish a worldwide, culturally rich picture of the complex entanglements of energy and architecture, of fossil fuels and the global experience of modernity, colonialism, globalization, and the struggle for zero carbon and climate justice. Finally, we should make sure that we take every opportunity we can of talking to people outside our disciplines. Many architects and engineers are longing to produce zero carbon buildings and to prioritize retrofit over new build. But to make this a universal reality requires a culture change far beyond the profession. We need to do all we can to help politicians, clients, and voters to understand what needs to be changed and to lend effective support to the necessary actions. This means spreading understanding in the clearest terms we can to everyone we can reach. You're privileged in London, where most of you are probably based, to have architecture that a worldwide public is interested in. we can use this to make a real difference. Through energy history, the profile of prominent historic buildings can be turned into a potent weapon in the fight for worldwide culture change. Learned conversations behind journal paywalls of the academy still have their place, but we can make our biggest difference by reaching out to the wider public with a simple, clear, pressing message that zero carbon architecture was normal for most of the past worldwide, and that its return is possible, vital, and urgent. We can stiffen our resolve to fight against today's fossil fuel norms, and we can cheer ourselves with the sustainable past when we are paralyzed by the pessimism born of constant threats of human extinction. We can challenge ourselves and teaching staff in studio, technology, and the profession to push harder for zero carbon solutions. And we can hold our own institutions and employers to account for their own carbon-intense building programs. Architecture has a pivotal role in averting climate catastrophe. Let's not miss our chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barnabas. We've now got this cruel moment of Zoom meetings where nobody can clap. Paolo's worked out the response, but obviously there'll be a wall of clapping that you can imagine. I've got so many questions for you, Barnabas. I've got so many questions, but fortunately, I asked Paolo and Marie and Grace. Paolo's our course leader in the BA Architecture. Grace and Marie, actually, I don't know what your statuses are. Are you both part 3? Is that right? Grace, where are you?
I'm a third-year architecture and environmental design student.
Excellent. Okay. And Marie, you're a part 3 student, aren't you, at University of Architecture? Yeah. So, okay. And I asked if they could have their own responses to your book and I guess a presentation now as well. Grace, I'm going to start with you actually, because I know that you had a very particular comment to make to Barnabas.
Sure, yeah. Well, really, this was a really interesting talk and it was really fascinating to read your book. So thank you. You did dive into this a bit during your presentation, but I wanted to discuss a part of the introduction that I found particularly interesting. You created a comparison between the pyramid of Khufu and the required amount of energy that it took to build that form purely through human efforts. And you bring up the question, how does this supreme ancient effort compare to the amount of energy a modern person uses in an industrial society? I think this was a really great way to picture energy and its exponential growth of what is capable today and how much of the energy becomes invisible to us because of how easy things are and how used to it we are. Our consumption of energy is a huge issue. As you say, every 7 US residents get through more energy than required to build the whole pyramid itself in their lifetime. And I wanted to ask you maybe to talk a bit more about the relationship between addressing the issue of energy, yet also allowing developing countries to still develop, understanding that the way we develop consumed too much energy. So kind of how do developing countries advance their architectural and built environment resources without making the same mistakes that developed areas have made? Is there a good way to establish sustainable methods and low energy use in the foundation of how those places work? Or what is the relationship between helping them learn from our mistakes and supporting them in being more sustainable, but not telling them how to develop, being conscious of our privilegedness of developing with access to such energy and industrial processes?
Yes, that is possibly the most important question facing the world today, I would say, and it's a superb one. And you'll be disappointed, but probably not surprised to hear that I don't have a clear answer to it. I have answers for some groups of people as to things that they can do to help a bit. So for the architecture industry in the rich world who've profited very extensively from enormous fossil fuel advantages in our past and present, it's totally incumbent on us to use our wealth and our privilege to do the expensive experimentation on sustainable technologies. I can't see any justification for failing to do so from where we are now. So if you look at something like solar, it started out as something that actually wasn't that effective. Until 2014, some solar panels were still being made that would never in their entire lifespan repay the carbon it took to make and ship and install them. But the process of scaling up solar production has brought the price down to the point where it's now in many parts of the world cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. And that is obviously a tipping point of enormous world importance. And each of these new sustainable technologies costs quite a lot and initially is a bit unreliable. And I think that one thing that rich countries which have profited enormously and very unjustly from past advantages from fossil fuels can take a significant role in helping by spending and spending and spending on getting this sorted out. And we're still per head enormously unfairly ahead of the rest of the most of the rest of the world in our per capita energy use. And so we can fight very hard and spend our own money to drop that, our own money individually and our own money as a nation. So I've got suggestions for what we can do. I'm very reluctant to make suggestions for what people should be doing in parts of the world that I simply don't have the level of knowledge, and it just feels completely culturally inappropriate for me to come out with manifestos for what parts of the world that have never had the energy service privileges that I've grown up with as a total norm. I don't have magic bullets to offer, but I do have things to insist so that we all in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in other rich, heavily industrialized and deindustrializing countries, we need to take all our courage, all our ingenuity, and all our money and spend it on sorting this out.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
I'm going to pass to Paolo now.
Yes. Hi, Barnabas. Fantastic to see you again. And great to have you here at Westminster. I was really intrigued by by your ability to visualize both in the sketches which your colleagues have worked on, but also in through narrative, to really visualize the impact of how visceral form can follow fuel. And so the early sketches and drawings and diagrams, where you could see the actual visceral input of manual labor and creating these vast structures to cities, which you then explored. There's a question there, because this makes it quite tangible, and yet the notion of form follows fuel. The notion of fuel has become more and more abstract. We're currently dominated by the modernist ideal, and cities are still being built in that notion. It is something which has and continues to dominate how we build cities, how we conceive and imagine architecture. And we've historically also had the environmental movement, which is slowly gaining track again, and yet it spectacularly failed to capture people's imagination. So how do you think the new or the continued paradigm, or the this renewed paradigm, can actually capture people's imagination again? Are there other aspects apart from the historic perspective which you have offered in the book, which will make it more potent and which will lead it not to fail as much as the attempts have back in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, there's a book, a film review recently by Smith Mordack, where they say something along the lines of, what the fuck is wrong with you that I have to sell you the idea of not dying in a flash flood? I think that's some of the answer, that the process of avoiding climate catastrophe has an obvious appeal to it. And I think a very large proportion of the younger generations of the world has a good awareness of this and a real sense of it as an urgent problem. In many cases, they have a slightly exaggerated panic-making sense of the timescale of it, which is a problem in itself that's causing psychological challenges and sometimes perverse behaviors, because if you think the world's coming to an end anyway, then why not fly around and see it before it gets wrecked? Which isn't the case. The world is on a sliding scale, not beyond any tipping points yet that mean that we're definitely doomed. So every bit of carbon we can save, and the sooner we can save it, still makes a significant difference. But getting the paradigm out, I think it's starting to spread. But in architecture and cities, people think it's complicated, so they're very easily bamboozled by greenwash or the new form of climate change denial, which is being pushed by corporate communications companies and the dodgy think tanks they fund. The new form of climate change denial is to say it's totally crucial that we get to net zero by 2050. But paradoxically, the best way to do this isn't the naive way of emitting less carbon. It's this really clever thing that actually we need to emit more carbon to do the following things, because it will produce a longer term sustainable saving. You can see examples of that in arguments I've had in my Twitter feed at various stages with some of these essentially new wave climate change deniers who say, yes, climate change is real, but let's not affect the economy in the interest of stopping it. So getting the message across how simple it is. And I actually wrote the book not for people like almost all of you, though I did want it to go to architecture students and architectural historians and so on as well, but I actually wrote it to try and get it to a non-architectural public and explain in the simplest terms I could how simple this problem is. Essentially, we're doing a load of things that involve enormous climate change emissions, and we need to stop doing them. It's really very, very simple. When you start to see the effects of the LETI legislation that's come in London, meaning that carbon footprint needs to be declared before planning applications for big projects, it's sensational. It's already got the Tulip by Foster cancelled, and the M&S flagship store replacement on Oxford Street has become a massive public scandal, because when you tell people that while they're trying desperately to cycle through dangerous London roads in order to save carbon, the M&S is replacing their building just in order to make more money from it, and in the process they are using an amount of carbon for the new building alone that could drive a normal family car further than the distance to the sun. And that really makes such a monkey of the rest of us trying to chisel away this and that from our carbon emissions, that putting figures to it really starts to make a big difference. So memorize a few of the key figures and bash people with them whenever you get the chance, in a friendly, unculture war-ish way, because culture war is probably the biggest danger to the planet these days.
Thanks a lot for that, Barnabas.
Great to see you as well, Paolo.
And Marie.
Hi, Barnabas. I'll just echo what everyone else has said, and a fantastic talk and a really kind of interesting way of conceptualizing the energy involved in these processes. I guess I have kind of two questions, one relating to architectural education, and then another probably more reflective of my own position as sort of a junior member of the profession in practice currently. So I noticed in your introduction to the book, you said that you didn't travel to research it, which I thought was a really interesting point. And I mean, you do comment that possibly it would have resulted in a different book had you traveled. So I wondered what you thought you might have lost by not doing so, and it being more of a desktop study. And how you think that might relate to architectural education, which typically encourages travel as a means of observation and of learning. And, you know, do you think that would impact architectural education to only learn about the further afield world secondhand? And if so, how we can reconcile, you know, having that experience and that kind of learning with minimizing our impact on the planet? And then sort of secondly, in terms of as a junior professional in practice, I noticed you mentioned these kind of 5 ways that we can make changes and keep the conversation going and collaborate. I guess that works quite well if you're quite well established, if you're the person in practice that is listened to frequently. I guess, how can we apply that in a more junior sense, where we might be the newest person in the practice?
Just making a note of your second question so I don't forget it in sounding wistful about travel. Brilliant questions, both of them. The former is one that I haven't been asked in any of the 20 plus talks and events I've done to do with the book, and it's a really good one. My first book was entirely about buildings that I had really close personal experiences of, because I find that there's something about getting up close to and using and touching and photographing and talking to people in a building is just incomparable, and you can't substitute that. A few of the buildings in the book I couldn't have done that for anyway, because they're not there anymore, but most of them still are, and I would have absolutely loved to travel around them all. And it would definitely have made the book, given the book a kind of a smell of the places that it doesn't have in many parts, I think. Several people have said that they like the Liverpool chapter best. I wrote it in Liverpool. So I think you do lose out by that, but it just doesn't make sense to fly around to fly around the world trying to reduce climate change effects. It's just too mad. So in terms of how I feel education should handle it, I think you can teach an awful lot of things about buildings, the important stuff about buildings, from the buildings within reach, wherever you are on the planet. Definitely anywhere in the UK, it's easy as pie, because any decent sized town in the UK has a quite wide variety of buildings. It would actually enrich. It's harder for the staff doing it, because you have to find out stuff about your own local buildings rather than trot out the same stuff about the same ones that are in all the textbooks. But it's more fun, and the students can do quite a lot of the work for it. You can set them assignments to find out about their local buildings and write about them. I set my first years every year an essay on the relationship between architecture and energy in Liverpool buildings of their choice. And they choose the building, they research it, they write it up, they draw it, and so on. So I think you can teach a lot of really important things using local buildings, and I think it enriches it gets rid of the sense of the canon, which is also really valuable, because canons are inherently suspicious. They promote a kind of a hysterical worship of a few big names that's automatically a bad history and not a very good way of thinking about architecture, in my view. So I think there are advantages to be had from it. Somebody in the comments I've just seen popping up, somebody saying cycle around the world. It's a wonderful idea. If you've got the legs for it and the time for it, that's a wonderful way to do it. I think travel is not something we should fully give up. It's so valuable. A lot of people in our current education system, and we profit enormously from this, culturally and intellectually, are a long way from home when they are students. And I can't bear the idea of saying, well, let's all just go to our local university. I really value the internationality of the student experience, and I don't know what to do about that. I do think that even people who are close to home for their studies have a complete right to do some intercontinental travel at some stage, but there's a difference between a kind of once in a lifetime trip with minimal flying, do everything you can by boat and road and train above all, and really make it count and value it and treat it as precious, rather than flying off to somewhere hot twice a year to top up your tan and get drunk, which is a spectacular waste of carbon, though a very enjoyable thing to do in itself, I suppose. So I think there's a question of proportionality about it. In terms of junior people in practice and what they can do, the ACAN is more or less made up of Architects Climate Action Network, which is truly wonderful. it's made up of people in mid-career and in some cases early career who are deeply committed to getting to a net zero architecture and reducing other environmental harms from architecture. And they spend their days working in many cases for practices where they know that the practice is still snarled up in the wrong ways of doing things. And they then spend their evenings discussing and researching and writing superb advice documents and organizing excellent events in this really sort of leaderless, brilliant network of people who are kept together by their commitment and their lack of showboating. And they are brilliant. So if you join them or support them in any way you can and go to their events, that's a huge thing you can do. And talking to people, because everyone kind of who isn't in some kind of mad climate change denying little bubble of Facebook lunacy, everyone else knows what we're fundamentally needing to do. And therefore, talking about it in calm, sane ways is weirdly influential, even if you're not a senior person who has authority to impose things. And you just say, oh, it's a shame we're using such and such cubic meters of concrete because that's the equivalent of 400 people's climate change emissions in the UK for a year. Just for the foundations, and isn't that a pity? And you just, in this kind of calm way, you talk about it as a real thing, and you don't go kind of furious and alienating. You just talk about it and say, yeah, it's a real problem with the regulations at the moment, isn't it, that we can't get around that. Do you think we could talk the client into swapping this for that, though, because that would save such and such, and that would be good for their publicity as well? And you just keep it on the agenda, keep gently nudging, and keep talking to people outside the industry as well, because the power of voters is needed to get the regulation we need. At the moment, the number one donors to the Tory party for quite some years have been JCB. Changing the subject completely, there has been a consistent refusal to change the tax policy that taxes demolition, that taxes retrofit of existing buildings, and doesn't tax, or taxes very low, new build. And obviously, if there were companies lobbying for that not to change, then they could potentially have quite a lot of power. Voters have more power than lobbyists, though. So if everyone knows that that's a complete travesty, then, which is a simple enough point, and Will Hurst and the AJ are doing a brilliant job campaigning on this with their Retro First campaign, then it will stop being politically tenable to carry on with these incredibly wasteful practices.
I was just going to thank you, Barnabas. I was just going to say, Marie, Grace, do you want to say something about WestCan? Because I know you are members of WestCan, or you're the only members of WestCan at the moment, and we need more people to join. Is that right?
Yeah, that point about ACAN it was a good segue into our kind of plug-in for WestCan, I guess. Yeah, I guess I don't know how many people here were around last academic year and know that WestCan was founded by, two graduated students now, Helen and Finn, who did an amazing job of kind of going from this grassroots two-person community to suddenly hosting kind of inter-university debates with Manchester and climate studio sessions. Myself, and I saw Alcan is also on the call, we were a response to an ARB consultation using some guidance from StuCan, or the education arm of ACAN. So yeah, we were doing all of these fantastic things and kind of constantly having discussions with the faculty and the wider school. And then this year, sort of, we suffered from graduating students, and it ended up just being me and Grace left, which has really halted us kind of doing anything productive this year, because with two people, it's just not really that feasible with our kind of workloads. So if anyone here wants to join WestCan and take some of that workload, we are more than happy to talk you through what we've done already, what happened last year, and how that can be kind of sustained in the coming years. And I guess give direction, but also if you feel passionate about wanting to take it in your own direction, I think we're also oversubscribed enough that we would leave it in your hands.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that and say if you can reach out to either one of us, we'd be happy to help connect you or kind of be a part of it. Yeah, if you care about the environment or kind of just want to take action in any way, it's a really great outlet for that. So yeah, thanks.
And can I just suggest to all staff who have joined us that if you have a conversation with a student, if you feel that they might be excited by joining WestCan, to encourage them to do so, get them involved and encourage them to get into contact with Grace or Marie and get involved in WestCan, because I think we can do as much as we can as well as staff. Now, if there's anybody else who wants to ask Barnabas a question, please do put that in the chat or put your hand up. And whilst you're thinking about that, I'm going to take the privilege of asking him a question of my own, or two. And I'm afraid I'm going to get really geeky and ask about architectural history and the practice of architectural history, both the practice and also the purpose. And I'm going to start with something that will please Barnabas, I know, is that I took some students this morning to Lasden's National Theatre, and they loved it. And they really enjoyed learning about it. They really enjoyed investigating. First year students really beginning to understand the practice of modernist architecture and the principles of modernist architecture and what Lasden was trying to achieve with that architecture. And how he went about it with the model making and so on and so forth. Right, okay, so they got really excited. And of course, they got deeply upset when I said at the end, you're never going to get this again. This isn't going to ever happen again. We don't have the political will for these kind of civic buildings, but we're not going to be able to use this concrete again, guys. This isn't going to happen. So one aspect of what I'd like to ask you about is what the purpose of architectural history is, if it's not going to be, look, here's some precedents from the past, the great canon, we're going to learn from it, because we're immediately going to tell us, nope, not that. Whatever you do is not going to be that. The other much more geeky question for architectural historians is, I noticed that the kind of the progress and chronology of architectural history isn't that disrupted by your book. It could quite easily settle in next to Pevsner's outline of European architecture. I'm sure you had that in mind when you were writing. And I'm wondering when we're going to get to a point where we start really disrupting that history. So I noticed that in your talk in particular, you're highlighting the ability from this perspective to disrupt a little bit the way we interpret, judge, assess the architecture of the past. But I wonder, what's the next stage? Are we going to start disrupting that chronology? Is it going to start looking very different as a sequence, as a sort of chronological history? So those are my two things that I'd saw. And in the meantime, if anyone else has got questions for Barnabas, do put them in the chat so that I can put them to him, or put your hand up.
Excellent, thanks. Fantastic questions, unsurprisingly. Yeah, the purpose of architectural history, we can offer direct, valuable precedents. Just as early modernists still studied the long history of pre-modernist architecture and found valuable things in it, there's no reason why we can't offer early zero carbonists incredibly valuable, actually technical things as well on occasion, but certainly ideas and approaches and materials from the whole of the pre-fossil fuel history of architecture, which suddenly acquires a level of biting relevance and value that it's been totally missing for most of the last few decades. You know, all of us architectural historians work on post-war Britain, with some honourable exceptions who work on post-war the rest of the world. I know that's an exaggeration, but it is disproportionate, and there's significant underrepresentation of most other periods and places, and particularly of anything before about 1600, say, is extraordinarily little. And it doesn't necessarily happen in architecture schools. And actually, before 1600 in the UK, before other times in other places, depending on when fossil fuels became a major factor in their economics. Those are the precedents we need. Those are the places where people were building durable, functional buildings, buildings with which kept you warm in cold places without fossil fuels, buildings that kept you cool in hot places without air conditioning. And obviously, it's not a simple matter of bringing back past stuff, but there's some of it that's almost straightforwardly bringable back one-to-one. And there's a whole set of inspiring alternatives where you look at something like the Baths of Caracalla and you think, this is in all sorts of ways an upsetting building from an upsetting time in human history. But as a piece of construction technology, it's extraordinary in its durability for such low heat inputs and such low material miles. And it's a really exciting moment in architectural history that you invert the values of so much. You know, you stop looking at the Bauhaus as being just the things it was in terms of exciting artistic and political thinking, and you start realizing that it's that, but also one of the worst environmental performance precedents you could ever look at. I strongly recommend to everyone here a wonderful article available for free without a paywall online by Daniel Barber on heating. It's called Heating the Bauhaus, and if you look up Daniel Barber Heating the Bauhaus, you'll find it, and it is just amazing. It's just a simple history of the boiler house in the Bauhaus and how it never managed to heat the building, to the point where the pipes froze with the heating on one winter, and to the point where now that they've done an environmental retrofit to the building, they've ended up with the famous studio block having to be abandoned. They don't inhabit it anymore because you cannot heat it adequately. And that is still used as an interesting precedent in architectural history courses, as if it was a building that we might have things to learn from on other than fairly conceptual grounds. I don't bin modernism, nevertheless. The thing I think is most valuable about modernism is its attitude to rethinking briefs according to new circumstances. So modernism is an extraordinary set of, I mean, among other things, is an extraordinary set of responses to quickly changing conditions by gifted and in many cases powerfully committed people trying to solve a new set of problems with a new set of tools. And taking that approach, Cedric Price still has a role as a person who questions briefs. And if you take not their materials and what their buildings look like, but their willingness to say, okay, the rules have changed, so we need a totally different architecture, then that is an enormously inspiring thing at a point where the rules need to change and we need a totally new architecture. And obviously a huge part of that's retrofit, but not all of it. And not all the retrofit will be using current, simple kind of understanding of retrofit that's totally sort of within the current architecture of the building. Some of it will expand the building and so on. And there's a huge amount of interesting new work coming down the pipeline if we get this right. And architectural history can be inspiring in all sorts of other ways, other than saying, isn't the Farnsworth house pretty? Why don't you try and do it, but double glaze it? And I think that's therefore making architectural history much more exciting and bringing the more remote bits of architectural history and the non-Western bits of architectural history more recently into a vastly greater literal immediate value, and de-emphasizing the history of the industrial West pushing and pushing and pushing this kind of universal modernism on the world. Other question, disruption. Disruption's the one word I wrote down from it, but yeah, I think we could. You're right that I deliberately wrote the book in a way that was intended to allow it to be integrated with existing survey courses, because essentially I see my role as being like a parasitic larva that grows in a caterpillar's head and turns it into a useful way of making more wasps. and therefore to smuggle it into other people's teaching, I didn't want to kind of be, I wanted it to plug in relatively neatly if possible. I think you could do the same study with a totally different set of examples that weren't well known. The other reason for using well-known examples is that there's anything on them. You have to have the material both on the surrounding energy economy and on the building. Several of the examples I wanted to do, I simply couldn't get the material on either the construction history or the energy economy, or in some cases both, and so I just had to abandon them. So I was limited to things I could get at in English and French, and that had both of those ingredients there. Otherwise, you can't do it. So I would love to see, I don't know, the next edition of Bannister Fletcher taking energy as a question in every single chapter, and taking that extraordinary internationalism and sort of chronological spread of that wonderful book, and adding this as one of the factors it considers in all of those buildings and all of those cultures and all of those times and places. And I think it's a process that inevitably, your two questions, the first one almost answered the second one. How are we going to disrupt it? And how are we going to keep modernism as a useful precedent? And the answer is, we're going to disrupt it by not keeping modernism as a useful precedent. But a building like the National Theatre, there's still masses of value in presenting it as an exciting response to the conditions. And the conditions then were concrete, steel, and powerful, cheap servicing. And the conditions, and a big welfare state expanding into the arts. And the conditions now are enormously different, but that process of model making and thinking about the city and thinking about the relationships between the building and its views and the building and its surroundings and the materials and the functions and so on, you can abstract good principles from good buildings that aren't necessarily, that will end up with a very different answer now that carbon's at the center.
Thank you, Barnabas. I see that Richard Difford has his hand up, and we've also got a question in the chat. I urge any first year students to ask Barnabas a question, because, well, we're studying him in the first year. And here he is. This is like, in the past, I'd have thought, oh, well, if only I had Nicholas Pevsner there to ask him. And your equivalent is here. So Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, yes. Thank you, Barnabas. Fascinating lecture. I have quite a simple question, really, which is what your thoughts were on the kind of history of changing expectations for human comfort. Because, obviously, the kind of early examples you showed, the kind of more primitive hut, as it were, very sustainable kind of energy equation, but also presumably the occupants of that hut had very different expectations for the temperature inside. For example, I'm sitting here in an office that is heated rather higher than I would like, to be honest, and but knowing also at the same time that it's much colder outside, and this and yet we do seem to have this expectation now that we should be living in 22 degrees.
Yeah, it's one of the most important questions certainly in the States and in much of Europe and Australasia, isn't it? This question of a kind of property market driven competition on narrowing the definition of comfort, where office buildings in particular perform to narrower and narrower definitions of comfort, and make that one of their competition claims that gets rid of the previous office. So you can say this is no longer A-grade office space and we have to pull it down because the temperature varies by 5 degrees from winter to summer. So yes, it's become, thanks in part to brilliant industry lobbying in America, and lobbying and marketing in 20th century America, it's become an incredibly powerful international indicator of architectural sort of quality for non-architects, of the business people who actually commission the buildings, to be able to wander around in a European business suit, whether you're somewhere very, very cold or somewhere very, very hot, with floor-to-ceiling glazing, and that's obviously deranged. So a big part of that is for us to, over a course of a winter or two, or a summer or two somewhere hot, adapt ourselves to a much broader definition of comfort, change our clothing more. It makes a big difference what you wear. I'm always struck by the number of people, including me this evening, who talk about sustainability in winter in their houses, not wearing a jumper. And that's a bit of a giveaway that I'm not putting my temperature where my mouth is. My children have colds, which is my excuse for it. But the business of getting yourself used to it. As an experiment when living in Glasgow, I tried not heating my flat for a couple of winters, and it dropped to 8 degrees at the coldest point inside the flat, borrowing heat from the neighbours clearly, because it was minus something outside. And it was cold, it was uncomfortable. I wouldn't want to do it years on as a less young man, and I wouldn't want elderly people to be trying to do it, but it was perfectly okay as a sort of 20-something or early 30s. I just wore a hat and thin gloves and 2 jumpers and slept under 4 duvets, and it was weirdly quite bracing and quite enjoyable after a while. And I got to the point where I found almost all interiors other than my flat horribly stuffy and moist and grim, and you do get used to things. So the history of comfort conditions includes an awful lot of conditions in which people weren't comfortable, but they didn't have a choice, if you go back more than a century or so, and obviously still in large parts of the world. But we are ridiculously beyond the level actually required for health in our definition of conditions we need, and we're ridiculously unadaptive in our clothing in a way that is totally unlike anything that we've seen in the rest of human history. If you want a wonderful historical study of the absolute cutting edge of comfort conditions in the late 16th century, my colleague Ranald Lawrence has done with Dean Hawkes, who supervised his PhD. The two of them have done a phenomenal study of Hardwicke Hall, Bess of Hardwicke's house, which she built as a quite elderly woman. She was phenomenally oligarch wealthy, for anyone who doesn't know her story, and she built this house as a comfort mechanism for an elderly person. And so it's the rooms are solar heated by the enormous windows. So she moved around the house with the daytime sort of in the opposite direction in summer and winter to stay cool in summer and warm in winter. She had the very clever arrangements of chimneys to really warm up the rooms that needed warming up. The whole thing's just really, really cleverly designed around its thermal systems. The study of it's just wonderful. And that's, we could use a lot more passive technologies to achieve our comfort conditions, and we could lighten up a bit about what we regard as comfortable. Really important question. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I see in the chat, we've got Daniel, who's got comments and questions all rolled into one, a challenge, I think, as well. So as form follows fuel, can one argue that the current architectural education fuels certain modernist ideals, which, although flawed from a climate crisis perspective, form the modern architect? Hence, how will architectural education need to adapt to the demands of the climate emergency? And he adds, will adapting architectural education to the climate emergency take away or hinder the ability for architects to cater to the needs of the modern man or woman, as Richard just briefly touched on?
Well, I think the biggest need of modern humanity is not to produce runaway catastrophic climate change. So that is now the biggest item on any list of functions for me of a building or any other human activity. Yes, I think it poses an enormous challenge to current patterns of architectural education. I think we're meeting them. One of the things I've always liked about architectural education is that it's very hard to impose anything on it, because there are lots and lots of different people giving it, many of whom don't have very much affiliation to the institution they're teaching within on the design side of things. And that's always attracted me because of its openness to difference, its tendency to produce kind of corners of eccentricity and tolerance, even if there's someone trying to be intolerant and orthodox. But now that I've got an orthodoxy I want to push, I find it very inconvenient. I don't know how we, without replacing any members of staff who are managing to bring themselves up to speed in a sort of horrendous authoritarian move, I don't know how we make the changes we need to make as fast as we need to make them. But given that practice is currently not really doing the things it needs to, for all sorts of very understandable reasons, people who are in practice are often behind the students in their appreciation of the scale and urgency of the challenge, and more hampered by the reality of current conditions and current market conditions, perhaps particularly, and current regulations, in a way that is producing maybe another of those moments like the Architectural Association in the 1930s, where there were fist fights in Bedford Square because the young student modernists couldn't bear being told to copy the classical orders anymore. Maybe we need to have more fist fights in that's not a serious suggestion, but the willingness to scrap about these things verbally and to have big important discussions about them, and to ask the questions. If students can lead this to some extent by asking the right questions, by pushing, by giving it as feedback, and this is how to affect your education. You say it in the National Student Survey, or you warn them you're going to, because the National Student Survey makes a difference to our standing in league tables, and therefore it really bothers people who matter and make big decisions. If you say, I'm going to mark you down when I get to my National Student Survey if you're not achieving a better level of training for us in how to use straw bales, or whatever it is that you're wanting to hear more about. And of course, students in architecture, to a greater extent than any other type of student I've ever known, do an awful lot of independent, impressive stuff when they're good. And they can lead the acquisition of knowledge on some of this stuff and bring it into the school to help out the rest of us on the staff who are behind you, and behind you in both senses, that we're not as technical, we're not up to date with all the technical aspects of it. Some people are, but most aren't. But we are also supporting of this as an intention. So I think we maybe need more conflict and disruption, but in a civilized spirit.
Thank you, Barnabas. I just want to say to everyone, Barnabas is not advocating that you mark us down in the NSS. We would much rather be punched. Okay, we've got a last, I think,
I echo that. Punch us all you need to.
The NSS is far too violent for us to take. From Josh. Thank you for the amazing chat. As students working towards projects circling around adaptive reuse in an age of climate crisis, what techniques can we apply to furthering our understanding of the physical fabric of existing buildings? So it's quite a big question for you there, Barnabas. So you can
phenomenally important question. Yeah, I wasn't seriously suggesting that you should take out things on the National Student Survey, but if you're in the first year, you could threaten to, and that would be amazingly powerful. Do so collectively rather than individually, so that you're not profoundly resented. And also be kind and be aware that these are human beings and a human system, and human systems are imperfect and take time to react to things. So be patient and supportive in it. The question of understanding existing fabric is, to me, one of the great challenges that architecture schools have at the moment, that we are not, by and large, particularly well equipped to teach adaptive reuse. And it's the most important aspect in a country like Britain, which has so many viable, robust buildings already and not a growing population. We have very little excuse for the amount of new building we do. And adaptive reuse is vital. There's quite a lot, increasingly a lot written on it, so you can find out stuff. And luckily our technologies of construction have been fairly unified for quite a long time. So an awful lot of our buildings are the majority of our buildings are 20th or 21st century. And during those centuries, there was an awful lot of shared building regulation and shared technology and shared economics that meant that it was actually quite affordable, quite standardized effectively. So if you have, if you can read about a building with a similar structure elsewhere, that could be a good way of getting at some of it. But I think in terms of the direction of architecture schools, I'm certainly looking to encourage anyone who's making a new appointment to appoint experts in retrofit, because it's an area that historically hasn't been huge in architecture schools. The architecture school model still has a tendency to favor the kind of big statement building, even if it's very respectful to context and things. It still starts with clearing the site and digging a hole, or starts on an empty site. And that is not what we mostly need to be doing at the moment. So it's a wonderful question. I don't have a single answer to it, but read and read and read. Quite a few of the really good practitioners who are profoundly committed to reducing climate change emissions in their work are also generous in open sourcing or publishing their work. This isn't about adaptive reuse, but War Thistleton are very good about making available their material on cross-laminated timber, CLT. So use their wonderful generosity in sharing that material. And there must be people who are doing that with adaptive reuse. AJ is covering it a lot, and there may be useful references in that Architects Journal. Ask your staff for help with it. At least it'll alert them to the challenge. But it's a fantastically good and important question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barnabas. I think it's 7:34. I think your work is both clarifying and generative. And I think if architectural history is going to be anything, it's got to be those two things. So thank you. Thank you for this evening. Thanks to everyone for your fantastic questions. Thanks to the respondents. And Barnabas, I hope that we can actually meet and I can buy you a pint.
Look forward to it. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for wonderful questions and really lovely quality of discussion and really supportive environment. Let's hope we can all get it sorted out. Thank you.
Thanks, Barnabas. Thanks, everyone. I guess we'll be closing the Zoom. I think that's how we do it now. So it's got that shocking quality, whereas in real life, you can gradually leave the hall. You can all say goodbye, shake hands, catch up with people. And in Zoom land, it's just boom. It suddenly comes down and everyone's just disappears. But I guess that's what we'll be doing soon. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along. And yes, I will try and make sure that this is the recording is publicly available from a Westminster platform that people can access.